Hello and welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm Cha Sang-mi. The deadline for the UK's withdrawal from the European Union has been set for March 29, 2019. But currently in the UK, Prime Minister Theresa May is delaying the parliamentary vote on the Brexit deal, while there is a growing call for a second referendum to rethink the UK leaving the EU. Today we discuss the controversy surrounding this imminent event. For that we have with us Paul Tongs, Professor of History from Yonsei's Underwood International College, as well as the Associate Vice President of the International Affairs. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Let's first take a look at this short clip.
The EU leaders met for a special meeting of the European Council in November to endorse the Brexit withdrawal agreement as presented by the negotiators of the EU and the UK. This meeting was held in 2 years after Britain decided to withdraw from the EU through a national referendum held back in June of 2016.
Take the necessary steps to ensure that the agreement can enter into force on the 30th of March 2019, so as to provide for an orderly withdrawal.
According to the agreement, even if the UK withdraws from the European Union next year, they're still obligated to abide by current EU regulations until the end of 2020, but cannot participate in the decision-making process within the bloc. The UK will also need to pay up to roughly £39 billion, or about $49.5 billion US dollars. While both the UK and the EU have begun the ratifying process, the UK is facing great difficulty as both the Conservative politicians as well as the opposition party that insisted on staying within the EU are strongly voicing out their discontent regarding the agreement. This is also the reason why British Prime Minister Theresa May decided to delay the vote in Parliament on the Brexit deal until mid-January.
As a result, if we went ahead and held the vote tomorrow, the deal would be rejected by a significant margin. We will therefore defer the vote scheduled for tomorrow.
May has attempted to renegotiate with the EU leaders on the backstop issue, but was ultimately rejected.
This deal is the best and only deal possible. We will not renegotiate. Our position has therefore not changed.
The EU is heavily criticizing the UK, saying that it is only trying to take advantage of the EU's single market, while the UK is bearing the brunt of the fierce domestic resistance to the Brexit deal. On this week's The Point World Affairs, we discuss the controversy surrounding the Brexit agreement and the possible scenarios of the future.
So, Professor, tell us about the issue of Brexit. Why is it so controversial? What does the UK want, and why is it not acceptable for the European Union?
I think the controversies perhaps principally lie, I think the single biggest controversy right now is over the so-called backstop within Ireland, the border between Northern Ireland, which is a part of the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Ireland, which is a member of the European Union. And in the event of Brexit, there would be a land border between the European Union and the UK. And that therefore brings in a lot of issues about how trade will be regulated, how trade can occur between the European Union and between the UK. And so the agreement that is on the table now, or that has been, in fact, finalised between the UK government and the European Union, provides for a so-called backstop in which, in a sense, principally Northern Ireland would be aligned with various European Union regulations on trade, would be in effect part of the European Union single market area, and the rest of the United Kingdom, that is mainland Great Britain, Scotland, Wales, England, would be outside the European Union. So there is controversy there, particularly within the governing Conservative Party in the UK. And also, I think this is particularly important because the government of the UK, the Conservative Party, doesn't have a working majority in the House of Commons, in the British Parliament. So it relies on the support of the largest party within Northern Ireland, which is a pro-British or so-called unionist party. It is in favour of Northern Ireland remaining part of the UK rather than joining with the Irish Republic in a unified Ireland. So I think that's the single biggest controversy that exists right now.
And Theresa May, she came back empty-handed after her meeting with the European Council this month, even after she had promised the public that she would guarantee this backstop, both politically and legally. So do you see that she might challenge some problems, some challenges to her leadership again?
Yes, I can give you an uncharacteristically short answer on that, which would be yes. The Prime Minister has, in effect, in order to, as some of your viewers may be aware, there was recently a challenge within her own party to her leadership. So other Conservative MPs basically held a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister as leader of their own party. Now, she did win relatively convincingly. So she won the great majority of votes of her own members of Parliament, but almost 40%, around 37% of her MPs voted against her. And I think most commentators view that as a significant harming of her authority within her own party. There's also the fact that, as probably your viewers will be aware, the UK has a parliamentary system and doesn't have a written constitution. And the power of the executive, the relationship to the legislature, the way that government operates is very different than in, for example, a country like the United States. And so we don't have a position with a distinction between a president and a legislature. That creates a lot of complexity. And I think based on recent history, a prime minister who's essentially indicated that they will not continue as leader and fight the next election, I think is on borrowed time. So I think, in short, Theresa May's time as Prime Minister is probably heading to a close, but we have very little idea when that will be.
Okay, let's connect to other experts around the world and hear their opinions.
On October 20th, a demonstration took place in the heart of London, England. It was a protest against the UK's withdrawal from the EU. The demonstrators claimed that many problems have been unveiled since the 2016 referendum and called for a second national referendum that properly reflects the public's opinions. As the day of Britain's exit from the EU draws nearer, an increasing number of politicians in the opposition party are calling for a second national referendum to ask the public again whether the UK should stay with or leave the EU.
Our policy is if we can't get a general election, well then the other option, which we've kept on the table, is a people's vote, a public.
Former Prime Minister Tony Blair, who has repeatedly expressed his desire for a second referendum, recently cited the survey result, saying that if the Parliament fails to reach an agreement on the Brexit agreement, the choice should be left to the people. In response, May strongly criticized the claim, calling it an insult to the Prime Minister's office and the people. She has also pointed out that a second referendum could possibly lead to a no-deal Brexit, which could cause further confusion and chaos.
It wouldn't be possible to hold a referendum before March the 29th of next year. That would mean having to extend Article 50. She wants to extend Article 50, delaying Brexit or leaving with no deal.
Seeing May's Brexit deal as a betrayal of the 2016 referendum, hardline Brexit supporters triggered a no-confidence ballot to oust May. But she survived the vote of confidence in her leadership, receiving 200 votes out of 317. We connect with local experts to see whether another referendum is actually possible, as well as the public sentiment in the UK.
Let's connect to a local expert in the UK to hear more details. Joining me now is Ronan McRae, a professor of constitutional and European law at University College London. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
The UK Parliament has been calling for Theresa May to strike up a better deal with the European Union. Do you think it's possible for May to renegotiate with the EU on the Brexit deal?
No, I think renegotiation isn't possible. For a couple of reasons. First, the other member states of the European Union have run out of patience with the UK. They feel they've already put an awful lot of time and effort into these negotiations, and they want the process over with. The other reason is that effectively for Britain, Brexit involves choosing one of two effectively bad options. One is they keep access to the European Union's single market, but that would mean that they keep following the EU rules and laws of that market, but they just don't have a vote anymore because they're not a member. And that's a bad option. But it's probably better than the other option they would have, which is to totally leave that market, be free to have their own rules and trading rules, but then lose access to the market because their businesses have been depending on that. So that's very disruptive. Now, Britain has to choose between one of those options. And because both options are bad, they keep kicking the can down the road and they won't choose. And I think that's what the member states are tired of. They just want Britain to make a choice. And Britain, as yet, won't make a choice. Partly because Theresa May's party in the British Parliament is just really divided and they can't make up their minds.
The public, along with former Prime Minister Tony Blair, have been calling for a second referendum of the Brexit deal. Do you think that the local public sentiment is against this idea? What is the public sentiment there like?
It's very interesting. It's very, very divided. 2 years after the vote, more than 2 years after the vote, the opinion polls haven't changed that much. They're still about 50-50. The real risk is for rerunning the vote is two. Well, first, the majority who won last time will feel robbed if they rerun the vote. And it's not guaranteed the vote will come out any other way. And because of the way the EU law governs the negotiations, Britain has 2 years to cut a deal. If they then rerun the referendum and it still leaves, then there's no more time to make a deal. They've used up almost all the 2 years already. So I think partly a new vote is becoming a possibility because Britain just can't make up its mind, and Parliament is so divided that they may try and break the deadlock by having another vote. But it's not going to be an easy solution to this problem. They may get the same result anyway, and there may be a big political price to pay just for British democracy, because there may be very strong alienation. A lot of the areas who voted to leave the European Union are kind of more deprived areas that have felt neglected by London and the metropolitan elite already. So they're already quite alienated, and they may be very alienated if they see their vote has been ignored in that way.
Thank you. That was Professor Rona McRae from UCL. Professor Tongs, what did you think about Professor McRae's analysis and the public opinion within the UK?
I think actually Professor McRae's analysis was very much spot on. I think he gave a very balanced and objective assessment. That would also be my own reading of the situation, particularly in terms of your second question about public opinion. I think there have been a large series of polls over the last couple of years. And as Professor McRae said, there's quite a wide spread, but to summarize in a nutshell, there's little evidence of significant movement. And as you may know, of course, polling is something of an inexact science. I'm not a psephologist personally, but there were considerable variations in methodology and results before the Brexit referendum, which generally speaking was not predicted by most academic experts. And I think now the sort of aggregate of polls shows something along the lines of a reversal of the previous vote, but they're pretty much all within the statistical margin of error. I think in a nutshell, as Professor McRae said, the country is very divided, is very polarized. We don't know what will happen. There may well be the same result as before. And people, if another poll takes place, those who had initially supported leaving the European Union may feel significantly aggrieved that their democratic majority vote was overturned. So I think Professor McRae is exactly correct to say that there's tremendous division and polarization and acrimony within the UK. And the problem is also that, as he said, the government is divided, Parliament is divided, and I think not just the government, but opposition parties, the main UK opposition, the Labour Party, also has very significant division within it, because many of its own voters voted to leave, and there's clearly a wide range of opinions in most parties within the UK, if you like, both on the left and the right of the political spectrum. Although generally speaking, the Leave campaign is associated more with the conservative right of the spectrum.
So how do other countries view the UK's current situation? Joining me now is Emmanuel Brunel-Joly, Jean Monnet Chair in European Innovative Governance at University of Victoria. Good to have you on, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
The ex-Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson set out a Super Canada Brexit plan as an alternative after the UK's exit from the EU. What is this and what's the reasoning behind it?
So I think it's a very, very difficult issue to understand where it comes from. It's easier to understand what it means for the UK and what it means for Europe. And in that sense, this is important to be reminded that even during the referendum period and just before the vote on the referendum question, a lot of people didn't have the fulsome information that is now available. And that's something that we can see in the media, but also a lot of experts are talking. Even within the two political parties in the UK, you hear people saying this, that they didn't have all the information up front, and that, now that we realize what it means for the UK and what it means for different parts of the UK, it should be rethought. I think that's an important point.
Professor, you are an expert on border policy. So what will this new border mean for Britain and its relations with the European Union?
There are two huge issues. One, obviously, is Northern Ireland and the negotiation, the backdrop agreement, basically, or the backdrop situation. But there's also the whole issue of imposing or rebuilding, rather than rebuilding a new border for the United Kingdom, right? Because right now, if you're trading goods inside the United Kingdom, you actually do not clear in the United Kingdom. It's very important to realize this. You clear custom with agents and harbors that are located in continental Europe. So the two issues are really important. If I talk a little bit about Northern Ireland, the whole issue with Northern Ireland is very complicated politically. But when you look at cost issues, just to illustrate the situation today.
We continue our analysis with an expert in the United States. Joining me now is Raj Bala, a distinguished professor of University of Kansas Law School, as well as the senior advisor at Denton's of International Trade Law. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Hello, and season's greetings, and Merry Christmas to you.
What impact the uncertainty surrounding Brexit will have on the world economy?
If we think about the trade relations among the different countries, we could conceive of a couple of different possibilities. I mean, the first is that in terms of government to government or country to country level, I think every country now needs to be thinking about its trade terms with both the EU and the United Kingdom. And it needs to think about renegotiating the terms for market access for goods and for services, and possibly for temporary migration of peoples. So that means, for example, Korea, which I believe already has started thinking about how to renegotiate both its WTO schedules and its free trade agreement terms of trade with the European Union, and then possibly entering into an FTA with the United Kingdom. And then with respect to the private sector, Korean companies need to start thinking, and I'm sure many of them already have, about their supply chains and their exposures in both the EU and the UK. So the long and short of it is, to your question, is the uncertainty has caused governments and private entities to rethink the way in which and the terms on which they trade with the UK and the EU.
And how will the trade environment between the UK and the EU change after the Brexit? Also, would that be beneficial for Brexit and the global economy, or would it be completely the opposite way?
Let's assume, first of all, that it's a soft Brexit, somewhat along the lines of Prime Minister May's proposed terms of detaching from the European Union. Well, in that case, Britain would remain within the customs union or with customs union-like terms with respect to the EU for a short-term period. So there would still be some degree of free flow of goods and services between the UK and the EU. And there would still be some type of common external tariff that the UK would participate in along with the EU. That scenario does not seem too likely because, as we know from the previous several days, the Parliament would have voted down Prime Minister May's plan had she actually allowed it to come to vote. Now consider a hard Brexit, which is what the Cabinet has indeed approved today, planning for a hard Brexit. Then on the 29th of March, the UK detaches from the European Union. So the common external tariff no longer applies. The UK would have its own tariff schedule for goods and presumably its own schedule for services with respect to merchandise coming in from, say, Korea. Likewise, the UK would no longer be in the customs union of the European Union, so goods and services would no longer flow freely.
Thank you both, Professor Emmanuel Brunejali from Canada and Professor Raj Bala from the U.S. Now, Professor, what do you want to add to those two experts' opinions?
I think now there have been a lot of criticisms, obviously, within the UK and perhaps outside of the UK too, about planning and indeed lack of planning for a hard Brexit. I think that this is clearly something that's becoming a more likely scenario. It's perhaps still not overwhelmingly likely. We don't know what will occur, but if these negotiations, if that kind of unity can't be brought about within either the government and indeed within the larger society and what you might call the political classes and so on, if that doesn't occur, then I think that it's quite likely that we will have more of an abrupt break. However, I think as Professor Bala pointed towards, I think that there's perhaps, whilst most academic experts in things like trade law and finance and economy would perhaps stress the downside, I think there are opportunities here, particularly within the East Asia region, particularly for a country like the Republic of Korea. There may be short-term disruptions and there may be uncertainty, which obviously businesses don't like. But I think in the medium to longer term, it's clear that both the UK government, I think all political parties across the spectrum, and of course business is very much interested in genuinely maintaining a global partnership and global trade relations. And I think they're increasingly focused on countries such as the Republic of Korea, attracting investment to the UK, British companies investing and trading with Korea. So I think whilst in the short term, perhaps we can be a little bit anxious, I think in the medium to longer run, I think we shouldn't be overly pessimistic, whether from the UK perspective or indeed the regional perspective in East Asia. And I think even on the global perspective, I think there'll be disruptions. There's clearly uncertainty in the short run, but I think that there will be worked out in the longer run significant opportunities.
Do you think there's still a possibility of no Brexit deal?
Oh, that's a real possibility. That's a very significant and important question. And I think it's important both within, again, as Professor McRae was talking about, the EU perspective and within the United Kingdom itself. There was a very important case in the European Court which basically adjudicated that the UK could itself unilaterally decide to give up Brexit. So the legal option, if you like, is there. I think that's where the law and politics come together in quite complicated and challenging ways. It may be that, for example, there's a postponement, that the government somehow kind of muddles through, realizes that there isn't a consensus and tries to simply extend this process. The problem is, I think, as Professor McRae also pointed towards, is that clearly at the European Union level, there's a frustration. They want to get this over with because it's really hampering progress about very important issues that need to be decided at the EU-wide level. I think it's also hampering the government of the UK. The government is basically completely focused or distracted by Brexit and unable to deal with a lot of other important issues, both in terms of domestic policy and international relations.
Okay, we'll definitely keep close tabs on this developments. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Since the Brexit decision was made, there have been increasing concerns the UK's withdrawal will trigger other European countries to do the same, and the growing uncertainty in the economy following the fallout. Now that we are on the verge of Brexit, the whole world is paying keen attention to what's set to unfold. That's all we have for this week's The Point World Affairs. Thank you for tuning in, and see you again next week.